Carlos Santana heard a man humming Oye Como Va on a sidewalk in Hollywood and decided, in the space of 30 seconds, to buy him lunch. This was not an unusual impulse for Carlos, who had spent decades looking for unexpected human connections in the spaces between his scheduled life, the sidewalks and diners and backstage corridors where ordinary existence happened without regard for celebrity or reputation. What was unusual was what happened when Carlos excused himself to use the restroom and came back to find two waiters attempting to remove his guest from the restaurant, while the guest, with the quiet dignity of a man who had been removed from rooms many times before, was already standing up from his chair. It was a Tuesday in March 2016, and Carlos was walking down Hollywood Boulevard on his way to a meeting, wearing jeans, a plain shirt, and a cap pulled low, taking the long route through the neighborhood because walking through Hollywood still connected him, in some inarticulate but genuine way, to the musician he had been when the city was still new to him, and every club and studio felt like a door that might open onto something extraordinary. He noticed the man sitting against the wall of a building near the corner of Highland Avenue, not because of anything visually dramatic, but because of the sound. Beneath the noise of the boulevard, the cars and the tourists and the street performers, a man was humming something. Quietly, mostly to himself, with his eyes closed and his back against the warm stucco wall. Humming a melody that Carlos recognized before his brain had consciously processed the recognition. The melody was Oye Como Va. The man was 58 years old and looked older. He was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, faded to the color of old concrete, dark pants with a fraying hem, and shoes that had seen several owners before him. His hair was long and unkempt, silvering at the temples, and his hands rested on his knees, weathered and calloused in the way of hands that had spent decades being used hard. Carlos stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk 3 feet from the man and listened to the humming for a few seconds, struck by the accuracy of the melody, which the man was producing with the unconscious precision of someone who had sung and played this music so many times that it had embedded itself in his nervous system below the level of conscious memory. Carlos sat down on the sidewalk beside the man, not crouching, not bending politely, but sitting down fully, cross-legged on the Hollywood Boulevard pavement, next to a stranger who was humming his song. The man opened his eyes. He looked at Carlos with the cautious assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate the intentions of strangers quickly. What he saw was a middle-aged man in a cap who had chosen to sit on the sidewalk next to him for no obvious reason. "You know that melody," Carlos said. The man looked at him. "Yeah, Oye Como Va, Santana. I used to play it." "When?" The man shifted slightly against the wall. "Long time ago, 1982, 1983. I was in a band in Tucson. We did covers. Santana, Eagles, Creedence, played the club circuit. Those were good years." "You played guitar?" "Bass, mostly. Some rhythm guitar. I was decent." Carlos looked at the man's hands. The calluses on the fingertips were old, from years without playing, but the shape of them was the permanent reshaping that came from pressing strings against frets for years. Musicians' hands, even after the music had stopped. What happened to the band? The man was quiet for a moment. Life, different directions. I moved to LA for other work. Work dried up, things got hard. The usual story. Carlos was quiet for a moment too. Then he said something simple and direct. "Are you hungry?" The man looked at him. The question was so uncomplicated, so stripped of the complicated social machinery that usually surrounded interactions between strangers in different circumstances, that it required a moment to process. "Yeah," the man said finally. "Come on, let us eat something." The man's name was Walter. He told Carlos this as they walked down Hollywood Boulevard toward Musso and Frank Grill on the same block, the restaurant that had been serving meals in this location since 1919, the oldest restaurant in Hollywood, a wood-paneled room with red leather booths and white-jacketed waiters that had hosted Charlie Chaplin and Raymond Chandler and Humphrey Bogart and every generation of Hollywood legend since the industry was young. Carlos had eaten there dozens of times over the years. He liked it because the food was old-fashioned and honest, and because the room had a quality of permanence that the rest of Hollywood largely lacked. They walked through the front door together. Carlos in his cap and jeans, Walter in his faded sweatshirt and worn shoes. A host met them at the entrance and looked at both men with the practiced assessment of someone whose job required him to make rapid judgments about which customers fit the restaurant's atmosphere and which ones required a gentle redirection. Carlos was wearing nothing that distinguished him as a celebrity. Walter was wearing everything that marked him as someone who did not regularly eat at Musso Frank. The host seated them. A red leather booth near the back, away from the windows. A white-jacketed waiter appeared within 30 seconds. Carlos ordered for both of them, a complete breakfast plate for Walter, eggs and toast and fruit and orange juice and coffee, and a lighter order for himself, delivered in the unhurried tone of a man who was accustomed to being in restaurants and who expected his choices to be honored without editorial commentary. The waiter left. Carlos and Walter sat across from each other in the red leather booth. Walter's hands were in his lap, below the level of the table, where they could not be seen. His eyes moved around the room with the cautious awareness of someone monitoring an environment for signs of incoming hostility. "Relax," Carlos said. "We are just eating." Walter nodded, but relaxing was not something that happened immediately for a man who had spent years in environments where the wrong move could result in expulsion. He sat with a residual tension that was not anxiety exactly, but a form of watchfulness that had become so habitual it was indistinguishable from his resting state. They talked while they waited for the food. Walter described the Tucson bar circuit of the early 1980s with a detailed, affectionate recall of someone whose best memories lived in that specific time and place. The clubs they had played, the songs that reliably filled the dance floor, the way a set could catch fire on the right night, when the crowd and the band hit a groove that felt less like performance and more like shared flight. He talked about bass lines, about the particular pleasure of locking in with a drummer who knew how to listen, about a version of Oye Como Va they had played one night that ran for 11 minutes, while the crowd refused to let it end. Carlos listened with genuine attention. He asked questions that were not general questions, but specific ones. Questions about technique and sound and the particular atmosphere of the venues Walter described. Questions that revealed a knowledge of the music and the circuit that would have been unusual in an ordinary listener, but that made complete sense coming from the person who had written the song Walter had been humming on the sidewalk. "Excuse me for one moment," Carlos said when the food arrived. He touched Walter's arm briefly as he stood. "Back in a minute." Carlos walked toward the back of the restaurant, past the other booths and the bar and the photographs on the walls. The men's room was at the far end of a short corridor. He was gone approximately 4 minutes. When he came back through the corridor and turned into the dining room, the red leather booth was not where he expected it to be in his field of vision, and it took him a moment to find it. When he did, Walter was standing up from his seat, standing in the posture that Carlos recognized instantly from 100 variations in other contexts, the controlled resignation of someone who was in the process of accepting an outcome they had been expecting but had hoped would not arrive. 2 waiters were near the booth, one of them holding the dessert menu that had been placed as a placeholder in the space where Walter's coffee cup had been. The head waiter was standing at the edge of the booth with the expression of a man who was performing an unpleasant task with the professional smoothness that came from having performed it before. The head waiter was saying something to Walter in a voice too low for Carlos to hear from the corridor entrance. Walter was nodding with the silent compliance of someone who had learned that argument made these situations worse, and that the fastest path through humiliation was to move through it without resistance. Carlos walked across the dining room, not quickly, not with visible anger, but with the deliberate pace of a man who wanted everyone in the room to see exactly where he was going and to understand, before he arrived, that the situation they were observing was about to change. He reached the booth and stopped. He looked at the head waiter. He looked at Walter, who had half risen from his seat and was in the process of reaching for his jacket from the bench beside him. "What is happening?" Carlos said. The sentence was phrased as a question, but delivered as a statement. The head waiter turned to Carlos with the professionally calibrated expression of someone who was about to deliver an explanation that had been refined by repetition into something that sounded reasonable, even when it was not. "We have a dress code policy for all of our guests," the head waiter began. "In order to maintain the comfort of our other diners, we need to ensure that all guests meet our—" Carlos held up his hand, not aggressively, just decisively, the gesture of someone stopping a sentence before it could complete itself. He looked at the hand waiter for 2 seconds, without speaking. Then he looked at Walter. "Sit down, Walter," Carlos said, "please." Walter sat down, slowly, as if not entirely sure he was permitted to. Carlos turned back to the head waiter. "This man is my guest. I brought him here. I ordered for him. I am paying for his meal. He is sitting at my table in a restaurant I have eaten in for 20 years, eating food I ordered, and you asked him to leave while I was in the restroom." The head waiter began to assemble another explanation. Carlos stopped him again. "I am not asking for an explanation. I am telling you what I just saw. I came back from the restroom and found my guest being removed from my table." Carlos unbuttoned the top button of his jacket with a slow deliberateness that carried more quiet authority than any raised voice could have. "If Walter leaves this restaurant, I leave this restaurant. And if you want me to leave, I suggest you learn my name first." From 3 booths away, a younger waiter who had been watching the exchange leaned toward the host and said something. The host's face changed. The host leaned to the head waiter and said something. The head waiter's face changed. The process of recognition moved through the restaurant the way a change in temperature moves through a room, not instantly, but unmistakably. One person and then another, until the new information had reached everyone who mattered. The head waiter turned to Carlos with a different expression than the one he had been wearing 30 seconds earlier. The professional smoothness was still there, but what was underneath it had been recalibrated entirely. "Mr. Santana," he began. Carlos stopped him. "The apology you owe is not to me, it is to Walter." He gestured toward Walter, who was sitting in the booth watching the exchange with an expression that combined confusion and a cautious alertness to the possibility that something had shifted in his favor. The head waiter turned to Walter. He said words that cost him something, though not as much as they should have. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said. "Please enjoy your meal." When the head waiter had moved away and the booth was theirs again, Walter looked at Carlos across the table. The coffee was still warm. The breakfast plate was still full, steaming slightly. The orange juice caught the light from the window 3 booths away and held it in the glass like something preserved. "Why did you do that?" Walter asked. His voice was quiet, not suspicious but genuinely puzzled. He had been removed from rooms before and nobody had ever come back. "You did not need to get involved." Carlos picked up his fork. "Because you are my guest," he said. "A guest does not get removed from a table while the host is in the restroom. I was only gone for 4 minutes." Walter looked at his food. He looked at his hands, which were still in his lap, still hidden from the room. He looked at the red leather booth and the white walls and the photographs of old Hollywood on either side of them. "My hands are dirty," Walter said. Carlos looked at his own hands. "Mine too," he said. 45 years of guitar strings will do that." Walter laughed. It was a short laugh, caught off guard by its own existence. But it was genuine, the kind of laugh that only comes from somewhere unexpected. They ate. Carlos let the conversation find its own pace, not pushing Walter toward topics he might not want to visit, and not filling the silence with questions when silence was what the moment asked for. They talked about music the way musicians talked about music, not about genres or chart positions or sales figures, but about specific moments, specific psalms, specific nights when something happened between a band and a crowd that defied explanation, and that everyone who witnessed it carried with them for years. After the food was finished and the coffee cups had been refilled twice, Carlos said something that Walter did not expect. "Are you still playing?" Walter shook his head. "Where would I play?" "I will find you somewhere," Carlos said. Walter looked at him across the remains of the meal. "You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to." Carlos put his jacket back on. "But you were humming Oye Como Va on Hollywood Boulevard. A man who hums Oye Como Va on a sidewalk is still a musician. He just doesn't have a stage yet." Carlos made a phone call that afternoon to a music foundation he had supported for years, an organization that provided housing assistance and professional resources to musicians who had fallen through the cracks of an industry that celebrated its stars while ignoring everyone else. He described Walter's situation, his background, his skills, and the specific quality of the music that had led Carlos to sit down next to him on a sidewalk. The foundation made arrangements. Within a week, Walter was connected to a transitional housing program for artists. Within a month, he was in a stable living situation. Within 3 months, he was playing bass in a covers band at a bar in Echo Park, receiving a weekly payment for the first time in years, standing on a stage with a bass guitar strapped across his body, and playing songs that he had learned in Tucson in 1982 and that had stayed with him through everything. The head waiter from Musso and Frank attended one of Walter's early performances at the Echo Park bar. How he found out about it is unclear, but he was there, sitting alone at a table near the back, watching a man he had tried to remove from a restaurant booth 3 months earlier play bass with a competence and ease that made the removal seem, in retrospect, not merely wrong, but absurd. After the set, the head waiter approached Walter and said something that Walter later described to Carlos. He said he had seen Walter and not seen Walter at the same time. He had seen a man in worn clothes and dirty hands and had not seen a musician. And he told me that he was sorry. Not for the restaurant policy. He was sorry that his eyes had worked that way. Carlos, when Walter relayed this story, said the thing that Walter would remember for the rest of his life. "That is the only apology that means anything," Carlos said. "Not I am sorry for what I did, but I am sorry for what I saw. Because what we see determines what we do, and what we see depends entirely on what we are willing to look for. Dignity is not something you earn by wearing clean clothes," Carlos said. "Every human being walks in the door already carrying their dignity. The only question is whether the room is worthy of the person entering it." That day, that restaurant was not worthy of Walter, but Walter was there anyway, and he hummed Oye Como Va on Hollywood Boulevard until someone heard him. That is what musicians do. They keep playing until someone hears.